The slap came so fast I didn't have time to react. It wasn't a hesitant tap, it was a full-force, open-palmed strike, delivered with startling venom. The crack echoed in the opulent, chandelier-lit ballroom, a sound so sharp and violent it seemed to suck all the air, all the celebratory bossa nova music, out of the room. My glasses, the simple wire-rimmed pair I'd worn for years, went flying, skittering across the polished marble floor before shattering, audibly shattering, against the gilded leg of a nearby Chiavari chair. 130 guests, dressed in their finest silks and tuxedos, froze, mid-sip, mid-conversation, mid-laugh, watching in absolute stunned silence. My cheek burned instantly, a blistering heat spreading across my skin. But the pain radiating from that impact was nothing compared to the sudden, icy compression tightening around my chest, stealing my breath. Serafina, my new daughter-in-law, the bride, resplendent in a cloud of white lace and tulle, stood before me, her face a mask of furious indignation, her eyes glittering with malice. She had just slapped me, her husband's mother, on her wedding day, because I had quietly, firmly refused to hand over the keys to my apartment. "That's what you get for being so selfish," she screamed, her voice piercing the horrified silence, bouncing off the high ceilings. "A woman your age doesn't need so much space. You're rattling around in there alone." The silence that followed was deafening, heavier and more suffocating than any noise. No one moved, no one spoke. The band fell silent. Waiters froze, with trays balanced precariously. I could feel every eye in the room fixed on me as I crouched down, my whole body trembling, not just from shock but from a deep, profound humiliation. My unassisted vision blurred the glittering guests into hazy, judgmental smudges on a canvas of social horror. I fumbled blindly on the cold floor for the broken pieces of my glasses. Some guests, like Serafina's exquisitely dressed aunt, looked away pointedly, their discomfort palpable. Others, like my own second cousin Martha, whispered urgently behind their hands, their expressions a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity, but no one, absolutely no one, moved to help me. No one stepped forward to defend the poor, unassuming old mother-in-law who had just been publicly assaulted and degraded. I risked a glance towards my son, Leo, my only child. He stood motionless beside his new bride, a frozen statue in his tailored tuxedo. His gaze wasn't on me, wasn't on Serafina, wasn't on the shocked faces surrounding them. It was fixed intently on a spot on the marble floor somewhere to my left, as if examining a particularly interesting scuff mark. As if I were a stranger who had inexplicably wandered into the festivities and caused an embarrassing scene. As if I were invisible, or worse, irrelevant. "You're not welcome here anymore," Serafina continued, her voice lower now but no less venomous, regaining her composure with chilling speed as she smoothed the pristine front of her ridiculously expensive gown. "Leo and I need our privacy to start our new life. Your apartment, it would be perfect for us, really. Just while we shop for something better, of course." Her words were pure, calculated poison, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone swatting away an insignificant fly. For months, I had endured her condescending comments, subtle at first, then increasingly overt, about my worn-out clothes. "Are you sure you want to wear that, Madeline?" My 10-year-old car. "Honestly, it's a death trap. My simple life. It must be so quiet for you." Quiet? But this public assault, this demand for my home, delivered with such contempt on what should have been a joyous occasion, this had crossed a line. A fundamental line of decency, of respect, a line that should never, ever have been touched. I rose slowly, my joints aching in protest, gathering the fragmented pieces of my glasses in my trembling hand. I could feel all 130 pairs of eyes still fixed on me, judging, pitying, perhaps condemning. They felt like sharp physical daggers piercing my skin. Tears streamed down my hot, stinging cheek, blurring my already compromised vision, but inside, something profound had fractured and reset, hard as forged steel. That slap wasn't just a physical blow that would likely leave a bruise. It was the final, brutal severance. It was an awakening from a long, foolish slumber of maternal indulgence and misplaced hope. For years, decades even, I had deliberately kept a low profile, cultivating an image of quiet humility and unassuming discretion. I had secrets. Deep secrets concerning my financial reality, secrets no one in this room, not even my own son standing there pretending to study the floor, knew. Memories of the last few months, the escalating pressure, the veiled threats, the calculated erosion of my autonomy, began to bombard my mind with sudden, painful clarity as I slowly, deliberately, walked towards the grand ballroom exit, my back straight despite the tremor in my legs. I remembered when Serafina, Sarah, as she insisted everyone call her, had first come to my apartment 2 long years ago, shortly after Leo introduced them. Her professionally beautiful face fell, almost imperceptibly but unmistakably, the moment she stepped inside and took in my modest, comfortable home. My cherished, slightly worn antique furniture, inherited from my own mother, my small, functional kitchen, perfectly adequate for one person. Seriously? She had asked Leo later, her voice a stage whisper just loud enough for me to overhear from the hallway as I brought out the tea tray. This is where your mother lives? It's practically a museum. From that moment on, every subsequent visit had been a subtle, silent torture. A masterclass in passive aggression and condescending judgment disguised as concern. Madeline, darling, you really should consider moving to a smaller place. She had chirped brightly 3 months ago during a tense family dinner, ostensibly celebrating my 69th birthday. At your age, it must be such a burden to maintain such a big apartment all by yourself. Besides, she'd added, placing a perfectly manicured hand possessively on Leo's arm, Leo and I are thinking of starting a family soon. We'll need more space for the baby. You understand. Her dazzlingly white, utterly fake smile didn't fool me for a second, but it seemed to completely captivate my son, who nodded along, seemingly losing all independent thought whenever she spoke, acting like a well-dressed puppet on invisible strings. The humiliations had escalated gradually, insidiously, like water slowly rising around a frog in a pot. First, it was the constant, thinly veiled critiques of my appearance. Madeline, don't you have anything more modern to wear? We're going to that new French bistro, not your library group. Then, it was the persistent worry about my perfectly functional car. That old sedan is practically an antique. It's dangerous for you to be driving that thing around Boston. What if you had an accident and no one knew? Next, it was dismissive comments about my volunteer job at the Boston Public Library Archives, a place I loved, a place that gave structure and meaning to my quiet widowhood. I just don't understand why a woman your age is still working 3 days a week instead of just relaxing, enjoying your retirement. Each phrase, delivered with a counterfeit sweetness, it was a small, poisoned dagger, stabbing relentlessly at my self-esteem, my independence, my sense of worth. My name is Madeline Hayes. I am 69 years old, and yes, all my life I have been a woman who prefers quiet discretion over noisy ostentation. I volunteer at the library 3 days a week because I enjoy the company of books and history more than idle chatter. I drive a reliable 10-year-old Toyota because it gets me where I need to go without fuss or fanfare. I buy my clothes at consignment shops and department store sales because I value quality and comfort over fleeting trends. To the outside world, and especially to the sharp, appraising eyes of Serafina, I am exactly what I appear to be, a modest, middle-class widow, living carefully on a fixed income, perhaps a bit eccentric, certainly financially insignificant. But that is precisely the image I and my late husband Arthur had carefully, deliberately cultivated for decades. What none of those people currently staring at me with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity knew was that my life had been completely, radically different before Arthur passed away 5 years ago after a quiet, dignified battle with cancer. My dear Arthur had not been the simple, unassuming accountant everyone in our social circle believed him to be. He had been a brilliant, intensely private, and extraordinarily successful investor, starting with almost nothing and quietly building a silent empire through shrewd, patient, and largely invisible dealings. We had made a conscious, joint decision, decades ago, long before Leo was even born, to live modestly, far below our actual means. To keep our true wealth, substantial multi-generational wealth, a closely guarded secret. To protect our family's privacy, to shield our son from the potentially corrosive effects of unearned privilege, and to ensure our security in a way that I now understood, with chilling clarity, had been tragically prophetic. Arthur always said, "Visible wealth attracts flies, Madeline. Invisible wealth provides freedom." As I finally walked out of the ballroom, escaping the suffocating silence and the weight of judgmental eyes, the whispers followed me like a toxic, invisible cloud. "Poor thing, she looks so fragile," I heard Serafina's aunt murmur, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "The bride is absolutely right, though. That poor woman clearly can't take care of herself anymore," added one of Leo's own cousins, a man whose children's college funds I knew for a fact Arthur had quietly subsidized for years. "Honestly, she should be in a nice retirement home by now, not rattling around alone in that big Back Bay apartment," another guest commented with that particularly infuriating brand of false compassion. Each carelessly spoken word, each ignorant judgment, was like acid pouring onto the raw, open wounds of my humiliation. The cool, almost frigid temperature of the ballroom's industrial-strength air conditioning contrasted sharply with the suffocating heat rising in my chest, a furnace of outrage and betrayal. My hands trembled violently as I fumbled in my worn black purse, a sturdy, practical leather bag I had owned and used for 5 years, not because I couldn't afford a new Chanel quilted flap bag, but because I had long ago learned to value enduring quality and practicality over fleeting status symbols, a concept my grasping daughter-in-law would clearly never comprehend. My fingers finally closed around my cell phone. I dialed a number I knew by heart, a number stored under a discreet, innocuous contact name, a number I hadn't needed to use in over a year because I had naively, foolishly, allowed myself to hope that the carefully constructed safeguards Arthur and I had put in place would never actually be necessary. "Harrison," a crisp, familiar, utterly professional voice answered on the very first ring. "Mr. Harrison," I said, my own voice trembling slightly but gaining strength with each word. "It's Madeline Hayes." There was a brief pause on the other end, perhaps registering the uncharacteristic tremor in my voice, the underlying urgency. "Mrs. Hayes, is everything all right? It's unusual for you to call on a Saturday evening." "No, Mr. Harrison," I said firmly, gripping the phone tighter. "Everything is decidedly not all right. I need you to come to the Royal Oaks ballroom immediately. Yes, right now. Bring the documents, all of them, the ones we prepared, just in case, the contingency protocol alpha file." There was another longer pause, pregnant with unspoken questions and professional concern. "Mrs. Hayes, are you absolutely certain? This is a significant step. Once we initiate Protocol Alpha, there is, as you know, no turning back. The repercussions will be immediate and irreversible." I glanced back through the ornate glass doors one last time. Inside the glittering ballroom, I could see Serafina, radiant and triumphant, laughing animatedly with her bridesmaids, likely recounting with dramatic flair how she had bravely put her difficult, selfish mother-in-law firmly in her place. Leo was still hovering nearby, smiling weakly, nodding along, showing not a single discernible ounce of remorse or concern for the woman who had just been publicly assaulted and humiliated at his own wedding. "My son." "Completely sure, Mr. Harrison," I replied, the ice returning to my voice, freezing out any lingering doubt, any residual maternal softness. 30 minutes. Please, no more." I hung up the phone and walked, not ran, toward my old, unassuming Toyota, parked humbly amongst the gleaming BMWs and Mercedes in the dimly lit parking garage. My steps were measured, deliberate. For the first time in many, many years, I was going to drop the carefully constructed mask of the modest, unassuming widow I had used to protect my family, to protect my son. For the first time, they, Leo, Serafina, and all those pitying, judgmental guests, were going to meet the real Madeline Hayes, the woman Arthur had married, the woman who held the actual power. And when that happened, when cold, hard reality finally crashed into their perfect, fragile worlds built on illusion, debt, and breathtaking entitlement, they would finally, truly, understand the devastating meaning of the word regret. The parking garage was eerily quiet now, most guests presumably still inside the ballroom, unaware of the financial and social earthquake about to erupt. The air smelled faintly of exhaust fumes and damp concrete. I sat in the driver's seat of my old sedan, a lonely island of genuine practicality in a sea of least extravagance, and waited. 30 minutes. 30 minutes for their carefully constructed lives, propped up by my hidden generosity and their own foolish delusions, to irrevocably change forever. 30 minutes for them to discover, in the most public and humiliating way possible, that they had made the biggest, most catastrophic mistake of their lives by underestimating, by disrespecting, by assaulting the quiet, unassuming woman who had secretly been bankrolling their entire existence more generously than they could ever possibly imagine. While I waited, the minutes ticking by with agonizing slowness, memories of how I had arrived at this precipice, this point of no return, began to flood my mind, an unstoppable avalanche of slights, manipulations, and growing unease. It hadn't just been Serafina's overt ambition and thinly veiled contempt. It had been Leo's gradual, sickening transformation from the kind, slightly goofy, fundamentally decent young man I had raised into this passive, compliant shadow, seemingly stripped of his own will, his own conscience, utterly beholden to his fiancée's whims and desires. It had all started subtly, perhaps 2.5 years ago, shortly after Leo introduced Serafina into our lives. He'd come to my apartment that first time with that endearingly nervous smile, the one I knew so well from his boyhood days when he was about to confess to some minor transgression. "Mom, I want you to meet someone very special," he had announced, his eyes shining with an infatuation that even then felt slightly desperate. And then she had swept in, Serafina. With her impossibly glossy hair, her meticulously applied makeup, her expensive designer clothes that seemed utterly out of place in my comfortable, book-filled living room, and that dazzling, unnervingly vacant smile that never, ever seemed to reach her cold, appraising eyes. From the very first moment, some deep maternal instinct, some primal alarm bell, had clanged silently within me. Something wasn't right. The way she looked around my spacious Back Bay apartment, her gaze lingering not on the family photos or the well-loved art, but on the high ceilings, the parquet floors, the sweeping views of the Charles River, evaluating every corner with a thinly veiled disdain, masked as polite interest, told me everything I needed to know about her true intentions, her priorities. "How charmingly cozy," she had murmured later, picking delicately at a loose thread on my favorite antique armchair, a piece Arthur and I had found together years ago. Her tone managed to imbue the word cozy with the exact opposite meaning: cramped, old-fashioned, inadequate. Leo, utterly besotted, completely blinded by what he desperately believed was true love, seemed oblivious to the condescension dripping from her voice. He just beamed, proud to be presenting this sophisticated creature to his simple mother. That first dinner had been a silent, excruciating disaster. Serafina barely touched the elaborate meal I had lovingly, perhaps foolishly, prepared in her honor, claiming she was watching her figure for an upcoming photo shoot I suspected was entirely fictional. When I tried to engage her in conversation, asking politely about her family, her background, her work as a purported image consultant, she gave vague, evasive answers, skillfully deflecting any personal inquiries. But she hadn't hesitated, not for a second, before launching into a detailed interrogation about my financial situation, her curiosity sharp, pointed, and deeply alarming beneath the veneer of polite concern. "And how do you manage, Madeline, all alone in this big place, just on Arthur's pension and Social Security? It must be terribly difficult to get by these days on so little money." She had probed, her eyes scanning the room again, calculating, assessing. What Serafina didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was that I had been observing her just as intently, just as critically, as she had been observing me. Arthur had taught me well. "Watch people's eyes, Madeline," he used to say. "They tell you what their words try to hide." Serafina's eyes, despite the practiced smile, were cold, hard, and relentlessly focused on acquisition. Over the next few months, as Leo and Serafina's relationship progressed, with alarming speed towards an engagement I felt powerless to prevent, I began to notice more disturbing patterns. Patterns that put me on high alert. Every time they visited my apartment, visits that became increasingly frequent and always seemed to coincide with requests for small loans or help with a deposit, she would make pointed comments. Remarks about how outdated everything was. "That wallpaper is positively vintage, Madeline." About how I deserved something better, something more modern, something easier to manage in my golden years. But her eyes, her sharp, calculating eyes, always lingered on the details that truly mattered. The prime location of the pre-war building, the high ceilings and original architectural details, the stunning panoramic view from my private balcony, the sheer square footage of the rooms in a city where space was the ultimate luxury. One afternoon, while Leo was ostensibly in the bathroom, fixing a non-existent leaky faucet she had pointed out, I clearly heard her speaking softly but urgently on her cell phone in my kitchen, presumably to her mother. "Yes, Mom, I told you. His mother's apartment is huge, easily worth millions, right on the water in Back Bay. It's insane." If I can just gently persuade her to move to one of those nice little assisted living places, for her safety. We could totally stay here for a few years, save a fortune, until we're ready to buy our own place. She's so sweet and naive, poor thing, completely clueless about money. She'll probably even thank us profusely for helping her make the transition to something more appropriate. Her words, cold and calculating, cut through me like shards of ice. But I forced myself to maintain my composure, greeting her with a placid smile when she returned to the living room, feigning complete innocence, the perfect picture of the sweet, naive, slightly dotty old woman she believed me to be. From that moment forward, every interaction with Serafina became a carefully orchestrated performance on both our parts, a silent, deadly game of chess where we both believed we held the upper hand. She played the role of the devoted, overly concerned daughter-in-law, increasingly worried about her frail mother-in-law's well-being and ability to live alone. I, in turn, perfected the role of the vulnerable, slightly confused, but ultimately trusting elderly woman, subtly resisting her suggestions while pretending to consider them seriously, all the while gathering information, observing her moves, understanding her true, rapacious motivations. Self-correction. The story is developing well, hitting emotional beats and plot points. I've significantly expanded the backstory and the dynamic between Madeline, Leo, and Serafina. Word count is likely approaching the 4,000 mark. I need to focus now on the confrontation scene in the ballroom, ensuring it's dramatic and detailed, followed by the aftermath and the final reflective ending to reach the target length and fulfill all requirements. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a relentless campaign of psychological warfare disguised as loving concern. The subtle suggestions escalated into direct pressure. "Madeline, you simply can't keep living alone at your age. It's dangerous. What if you were to fall and no one found out for days? We'd never forgive ourselves." Serafina would say, her voice laced with manufactured anxiety, usually in front of Leo to maximize his guilt. Each argument, each hypothetical tragedy was meticulously designed to make me feel incompetent, burdensome, and ultimately helpless. Leo, my own son, tragically began to echo her phrases like a well-trained parrot, his brow furrowed with a semblance of genuine worry that I knew was merely a reflection of Serafina's manipulative coaching. "Mom, maybe Sarah has a point," he'd say tentatively during their increasingly frequent visits. "It is a big place for one person. Maybe it would be better for everyone, safer for you, if you considered moving to a smaller, more manageable place. We could help you find something lovely." Seeing him parrot her lines, watching him gradually transform from my independent, thoughtful son into this passive, compliant puppet dancing to her tune, was more agonizing than any direct insult Serafina could hurl at me. The boy I had raised with so much love, effort, and sacrifice, instilling values of honesty, hard work, and respecting one's elders, now clearly saw me primarily as an obstacle to his fiancée's desires, an inconvenient problem to be solved. The pressure intensified exponentially after they officially announced their engagement and set the date for the extravagant wedding I now found myself ejected from. Visits became more frequent, almost suffocatingly so, but also fraught with an underlying tension that crackled in the air. Serafina had started bringing glossy real estate magazines featuring luxury condos and slick brochures for upscale senior lifestyle communities that looked more like sterile hotels than homes. "I'm just exploring options for you, Madeline, darling. No pressure at all," she would chirp, spreading the offensive materials across my antique coffee table as if initiating a high-stakes business negotiation rather than discussing the potential uprooting of my entire life. "I just want to make sure you have the absolute best quality of life possible in your later years." But I had been doing my own, far more effective research. One afternoon, seizing an opportunity while they were out tasting ridiculously overpriced wedding cakes, I made the call to Mr. Harrison, my trusted financial advisor and the only person on earth besides my late husband who knew the true extent of my wealth. "Mr. Harrison," I'd said, my voice low and urgent, "I need you to conduct a thorough, discreet investigation. My son, Leo Hayes, and his fiancée, Serafina Dawson. I need to know their real financial situation. Everything. Debts, income, assets, liabilities, everything." The results of that investigation, delivered a week later in a sealed manila envelope marked "strictly confidential," had been devastating, confirming my worst fears, and then some. Leo, despite his impressive job title and outward appearance of success, was earning a respectable $150,000 annually as a senior sales manager, but he had managed to accumulate staggering personal debts of over $250,000, mostly on high-interest credit cards, unsecured personal loans, and a disastrously underwater mortgage on his previous condo. Serafina, who worked sporadically, if at all, as a self-proclaimed image consultant, appeared to have virtually no income of her own, yet spent money as if she possessed an unlimited trust fund. Together, their combined unsecured debt exceeded $400,000, not even counting the astronomical loans they had apparently taken out from multiple sources to finance the obscenely extravagant $75,000 wedding currently in progress. The luxury apartment they rented for nearly $5,000 a month was 3 months behind on payments, and eviction proceedings had been initiated. The sleek European cars they drove were leased, with monthly payments that consumed almost 60% of Leo's net income. Their primary credit cards were maxed out, and they had resorted to taking out predatory cash advances at exorbitant interest rates simply to pay other urgent debts. They weren't just living beyond their means. They were in a state of catastrophic financial freefall, teetering on the brink of utter ruin. Suddenly, everything clicked into horrifying focus. The desperate rush to get married, the relentless, escalating insistence that I vacate my valuable apartment, the constant, insidious comments designed to undermine my confidence and portray me as economically vulnerable, perhaps even mentally frail. It wasn't love or even misguided ambition that had united this ill-fated couple. It was sheer, unadulterated financial desperation. And my spacious, mortgage-free apartment, located in one of the most desirable and expensive neighborhoods in Boston, represented their only viable lifeline, their only hope of staving off complete financial collapse. My home wasn't just a convenience for them, it was their emergency escape hatch. The stark, ugly revelation hit me not like a slap, but like a physical blow to the soul. My son, the boy I had painstakingly raised, instilling values of honesty, integrity, and hard work, had chosen the treacherous, easy path of manipulation and deceit. He hadn't just fallen in love with an ambitious, morally bankrupt woman. He had actively allowed her, perhaps even encouraged her, to convince him to see his own mother not as a person to be cherished and respected, but as a resource to be exploited, a problem to be eliminated. In the final tense weeks leading up to the wedding day, their attempts to dislodge me became more aggressive, less veiled. "Madeline, you simply cannot keep being so stubbornly selfish." Serafina had snapped at me just 3 days before the ceremony, her voice finally shedding the last pretense of counterfeit concern. "Leo and I have sacrificed so much for this marriage, taken on so much debt. The very least you can do is help us out with a place to live. It's the decent thing to do." Her words were no longer even disguised as a polite suggestion or a loving family favor. They were a direct, entitled demand. That night, alone in my quiet apartment staring out at the glittering lights of the city skyline, I had made the irrevocable decision that would culminate in tonight's dramatic confrontation. I called Mr. Harrison. I need you to prepare the contingency protocol alpha documents immediately. I had told him, my voice trembling but resolute. It's possible, no, it's probable, that I will need them activated very, very soon. His voice had become instantly serious, devoid of its usual professional warmth. Mrs. Hayes, are you absolutely certain this is the necessary course of action? Protocol Alpha is extreme. Once initiated, the effects are immediate and irreversible. The consequences, particularly for family relationships. I understand the consequences perfectly, Mr. Harrison, I had interrupted gently but firmly. The family I have been trying so desperately to protect with my silence, with my carefully constructed anonymity, has already chosen to betray me in the most fundamental way. There is nothing left to preserve. And now, sitting here in my old, unassuming car in the dimly lit parking garage of the opulent Royal Oaks ballroom, waiting for Mr. Harrison to arrive with the very documents that would dismantle their world, I realized, with a strange mixture of profound sadness and icy resolve, that the moment of unavoidable truth, the moment of painful but necessary reckoning, had finally, irrevocably arrived. 15 more minutes. 15 more minutes, and everything would change forever. My hands, surprisingly, were steady now as I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back was older, yes, her face etched with the lines of worry and time. But her eyes, clear and focused, held a strength, a quiet determination, that Serafina, in her arrogant cruelty, had fatally underestimated. 15 more minutes, and their perfect worlds, built on a foundation of lies, debt, and breathtaking greed, would crumble around them like castles made of sand. The cool night breeze rustled, the autumn leaves still clinging to the trees lining the garage, creating dancing, ephemeral shadows under the sodium lamps. It felt strangely, darkly poetic that on such a beautiful, celebratory night, so many toxic illusions were about to wither and die forever. The reckoning was at hand. Self-correction. The story is well within the word count range now. I have detailed the backstory, the motivations, and the emotional build-up significantly. The final confrontation and the reflective ending remain. I need to ensure the ending provides the required humanistic lesson and avoids the original YouTube call to action format completely. The final scene unfolded with the dramatic, almost theatrical flair Serafina herself might have appreciated, had she not been its tragic protagonist. As Mr. Harrison and I re-entered the ballroom, the lively bossa nova music faltered, then died abruptly, replaced by a thick, expectant silence. All 130 pairs of eyes swiveled towards us, a collective sea of confusion, curiosity, and dawning apprehension. Serafina, who had been holding court near the towering wedding cake, whirled around, her face instantly contorting with rage. "What are you doing back here?" she shrieked, pointing an accusatory, diamond-laden finger at me. "I told you to leave. Security! Get her out of here!" Before any bewildered security guards could react, Mr. Harrison stepped forward, his calm, authoritative presence instantly commanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the cavernous room, clear and professional. "I apologize sincerely for this interruption to the celebration. However, I am here this evening on urgent legal and financial business concerning Mr. Leo Hayes and his new wife, Mrs. Serafina Hayes." The silence that followed was absolute, profound. You could have heard a champagne bubble pop. Guests froze, forks halfway to mouths, glasses suspended in midair. Cell phones, predictably, began to emerge, discreetly at first, then more brazenly, as people sensed they were about to witness something far more memorable than a traditional cake-cutting ceremony. Leo, his face deathly pale beneath his expensive tan, slowly, hesitantly approached us, detaching himself from Serafina's side. "Mom? What is going on here?" he stammered, his eyes darting nervously between me and the imposing figure of Mr. Harrison, clutching his leather briefcase like a shield. "Who is this man? Why is he talking about legal matters? This is my wedding." I could see his hands trembling slightly as he instinctively adjusted his perfectly knotted tie, a nervous tic he'd had since childhood whenever he felt cornered or exposed. "Leo," I said, my voice firmer, clearer than it had sounded in months, perhaps years. The tremor was gone, replaced by an unnerving calm. "This is Mr. Harrison. He has been my financial and legal advisor for over 20 years. He has come here tonight to deliver some important documents. Documents that I believe you, and especially your bride." I allowed my gaze to drift pointedly towards Serafina, who was now watching us with narrowed, suspicious eyes, will find very enlightening. Mr. Harrison, taking his cue, opened his briefcase with a decisive snap and took out the first document, a crisp legal notice. "Mr. Leo Hayes," he began, his voice formal, devoid of inflection, "pursuant to instructions received from your mother, Mrs. Madeline Hayes. You are hereby formally notified that the substantial financial guarantee she had confidentially provided for your current apartment lease agreement has been immediately and irrevocably cancelled, effective as of this moment. Your landlord will be officially notified by registered mail tomorrow morning. You will have, according to the terms of your lease, 30 days to provide a new, qualifying guarantor or vacate the property." All the remaining color drained from Leo's face. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. "Financial guarantee?" he murmured, the words barely audible, his eyes filling with a mixture of dawning comprehension and utter horror. "Mom, what is he talking about? I negotiated that lease myself." I saw the flicker of understanding in his eyes. He knew, or at least, a part of him had always suspected. For years he had perhaps wondered deep down how his financial luck always seemed to hold, how rent decreases mysteriously materialized, how credit limits inexplicably increased. But he had chosen, consciously or subconsciously, not to ask the uncomfortable questions, preferring the comfort of willful ignorance, the ease of subsidized reality. "Furthermore," Mr. Harrison continued relentlessly, pulling out a second, thicker document, a detailed bank statement summary, "the significant monthly financial transfers, averaging approximately $5,000 per month, that your mother had been discreetly making into various accounts held jointly or individually by you and Miss Dawson, now Mrs. Hayes, for the past 36 months, have also been permanently suspended, effective immediately." He paused, letting the weight of the number sink in. "This includes, but is not limited to, direct payments covering credit card balances, vehicle insurance premiums, student loan installments, and various other personal and household expenses that you may have believed were being covered by other sources, such as work bonuses or investment returns." Serafina let out a choked gasp that echoed throughout the now utterly silent ballroom. $5,000 a month? For 3 years? She shrieked, rushing towards us, her ridiculously long train tangling around her ankles. "That's impossible! It's a lie! He doesn't get any money from her! She's a poor old woman! Look at her!" She gestured wildly towards me, towards my simple dress, my sensible shoes, my lack of ostentatious jewelry. "Look at her clothes! Her ancient car! She works part-time at a dusty old library, for God's sake! She can't possibly have that kind of money!" Her hysteria was palpable now, her carefully constructed facade crumbling rapidly, revealing the raw, grasping desperation beneath. Several guests began to murmur amongst themselves, their expressions shifting from shock to fascination. "And finally," Mr. Harrison announced, his voice cutting through Serafina's rising panic as he took the last document from his briefcase, "the irrevocable letter of credit guaranteeing the full payment for this entire celebration, including the ballroom rental, the catering, the open bar, the orchestra, the floral arrangements, and the photography services, provided confidentially by Mrs. Madeline Hayes, has also been cancelled, effective immediately." He turned slightly, addressing the ballroom manager, Mr. Dubois, who was now pushing his way through the stunned crowd, his face a mask of grim understanding. "The venue management will, therefore." have the right to demand full and immediate alternative payment before any guests are permitted to leave the premises this evening." Those final words fell upon the ballroom like a detonated bomb. A collective gasp went through the remaining guests. Several people, particularly those near the exits, nervously began to gather their belongings, eyeing the doors with sudden urgency. The elegant celebration had instantly transformed into a potential hostage situation, predicated on the newlyweds' ability to conjure $75,000 out of thin air. The full, catastrophic realization finally hit Leo like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his eyes wide with disbelief, fixed on my face. "You," he muttered, the word choked with a mixture of horror and betrayal. "It was you. All this time. You've been paying for everything? My rent? My car? This wedding?" His voice broke on the last word, and for a fleeting, heart-wrenching moment, I saw not the weak, complicit man standing before me, but the small, vulnerable boy he had once been, lost and utterly confused. "For 3 years, Leo," I confirmed, my voice quiet now, heavy with the weight of those years, the weight of his betrayal. 36 months. $180,000. Money I freely gave because I thought I was helping my son, helping him get through what I believed was a temporary difficult time. Money I gave because I believed you would eventually recover, find your footing, and become the responsible, honorable man I raised you to be. Money I gave because I foolishly hoped you would remember the values your father and I tried so hard to teach you: honesty, integrity, living within your means. Serafina began to pace back and forth in tight circles, clutching her head, her movements jerky, frantic, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "This can't be happening. This isn't real. It's some kind of sick joke," she screamed, turning wildly towards the remaining guests, as if seeking validation, looking for someone, anyone, to refute the impossible truth that was crashing down around her. "She's lying. She has to be. She's a poor old woman. She works in a library. She drives a 10-year-old car. She can't possibly have this kind of money." "Appearances, my dear Serafina," I said, finally, my voice calm and steady, cutting through her rising hysteria, feeling decades of carefully constructed performance, of deliberate self-effacement, falling away like old, dry leaves. "Appearances can be, and often are, deceiving. For many years I chose to live simply, modestly. My late husband Arthur and I valued privacy and security above ostentation. We learned early on that visible wealth often attracts problems." My gaze flickered meaningfully towards her. "It turns out we were absolutely right. It's just that the most significant problems, the most dangerous ones, came not from strangers, but from where we least expected them, from within our own family." The music had stopped completely hours ago, it seemed. The only sound in the vast, opulent ballroom now was the agitated, shallow breathing of the newlyweds, the growing, restless murmuring of the remaining guests, who were beginning to understand they were witnessing not just a family spat, but the complete and utter detonation of a carefully crafted illusion, and the insistent, increasingly impatient voice of Mr. Dubois demanding payment. Several guests were now openly recording the scene with their phones, instinctively recognizing that this raw, shocking display of familial implosion would soon become the stuff of local legend, recounted with relish at dinner parties for years to come. "Mom," Leo pleaded, his voice broken now, stripped bare of all pretense. He took a hesitant step towards me, his hands outstretched slightly, palms up, a gesture of supplication. "Please, Mom, please. There has to be some way to fix this, to undo this. The wedding, the guests, our future, everything." But I could see in his tear-filled eyes, even as he begged, that he was finally, truly beginning to comprehend the full magnitude of what he had lost. It wasn't just the money, the apartment, the comfortable, subsidized lifestyle. He had lost his mother. He had lost the woman who had loved him unconditionally, supported him unquestioningly, for his entire 35 years of life. He had traded her love and loyalty for, what? A mountain of debt and a venomous, grasping wife who had just publicly assaulted her? "The only way to fix this, Leo," I replied, my voice softer now, tinged with a profound, weary sadness, was not to break it so catastrophically in the first place. The ballroom remained in absolute stunned silence. 130 guests held their collective breath, witnesses to the final, definitive end of a family relationship. Serafina stood motionless for the first time all night, her face a mask of disbelief, her eyes darting wildly between Mr. Harrison, the damning documents he still held, and my impassive face, as if desperately trying to find a flaw, a loophole, a crack in the brutal, inescapable reality that was collapsing around her. Leo just stared at me, his expression one I will likely carry with me to my grave, a devastating mixture of profound shock, belated, agonizing comprehension, and absolute soul-crushing horror. Mrs. Hayes, Mr. Harrison said quietly into the tense silence, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear clearly, deliberately twisting the knife just a little deeper. Would you like me to proceed now with reading the full, detailed accounting of your previously undisclosed assets and net worth, for clarity's sake? 4. His question hung in the air like a guillotine blade poised over the newlyweds' exposed necks. I could see several guests unconsciously leaning closer, their faces alight with fascinated horror, eager for the final, gruesome act of this unexpected social drama. I met Leo's pleading, desperate gaze across the suddenly vast expanse of the marble floor. I held it for a long moment. Then, I gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of my head. "No, Mr. Harrison," I replied, my voice carrying clearly in the stillness, imbued with a quiet authority that surprised even myself. "That won't be necessary. I believe everyone here understands the situation perfectly now." The point had been made, the lesson delivered. Further humiliation felt unnecessary, perhaps even cruel. And despite everything, cruelty was not my aim. Justice was, clarity was, consequences were. Serafina finally collapsed, not dramatically, not theatrically, but with a sudden, complete surrender. She literally crumpled into a nearby gilded chair, burying her face in her hands, and began to sob, not the calculated tears of manipulation I had witnessed before, but deep, wrenching, uncontrolled sobs of genuine despair that echoed horribly through the silent ballroom. Everything is ruined," she murmured brokenly through her tears, the words muffled by her hands. "Everything we planned, everything we worked for, it's all destroyed." Her once immaculate, the fairy tale wedding dress was now wrinkled, possibly stained with tears and smeared makeup, a pathetic symbol of her shattered ambitions. I walked slowly towards her then, stopping directly in front of the chair where she huddled, forcing her to look up, to meet my gaze. "No, Serafina," I said, my voice quiet but firm, devoid of anger now, only a vast, weary sadness. "What's destroyed tonight are the lies. What's destroyed is the greed. What's destroyed is the profound lack of respect, of basic human decency." I paused, letting my words sink in. "What's destroyed is the dangerous illusion that you can treat people, especially family, like disposable objects, like inconvenient obstacles to be manipulated and discarded, and expect there to be no consequences." I held her gaze for another long moment. "This," I said softly, gesturing around the ruined ballroom, the fleeing guests, her sobbing form, "this is what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness, when you mistake generosity for entitlement, when you mistake silence for stupidity." Leo went to his wife then, placing a trembling, uncertain hand on her shoulder. Sarah, we have to find a way to fix this," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "There has to be something we can do." But even as he spoke the words, I could see in his lost, devastated eyes that he knew, finally, irrevocably, that it was far too late. Some bridges, once burned so completely, so deliberately, simply cannot be rebuilt. "There is a way to fix this, Leo," I said, turning to him, looking him directly in the eyes for perhaps the first time in months without the filter of maternal hope, seeing him clearly for the flawed, weak, easily corrupted man he had allowed himself to become. "There is always a way forward. You can learn from this. You can grow from this. You can, perhaps, eventually, become the kind of man, the kind of husband, the kind of son I always hoped you would be, the man your father would have been proud of. Before ambition and greed were allowed to corrupt you." My voice softened slightly then, because despite everything, despite the profound betrayal, he was still my son, the child I had carried, nurtured, loved. "But," I added firmly, the steel returning to my tone, "that growth, that learning, that potential redemption will have to happen entirely without my financial assistance, without the safety net of my apartment, and, as you now know, without the expectation of my inheritance. You will have to do it the hard way, Leo, like everyone else in the world does. By taking responsibility for your own choices, your own mistakes, your own life." With those final words, I turned, nodded briefly to Mr. Harrison, and walked towards the exit, leaving behind the shambles of the wedding, the wreckage of their meticulously planned future, the shocked whispers of the remaining guests, and the devastating, a harsh reality of fully deserved consequences settling upon the newlywed couple whose perfect world had imploded in less than 30 minutes. My stride was steady, my head held high. The war was over. And though the losses were profound, I knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within my soul, that I had, finally, unequivocally, won back myself. The aftermath was predictably messy, yet quietly cathartic. The wedding naturally ended in chaos and recrimination. Mr. Dubois, the ballroom manager, true to his word and likely relishing the drama, had indeed instructed his staff to politely but firmly prevent guests from leaving until a credible payment arrangement for the outstanding $75,000 bill was established. This led to a humiliating scene where Serafina's horrified and enraged parents were ultimately strong-armed into signing a personal guarantee, possibly leveraging their own home to cover the exorbitant cost of their daughter's disastrous nuptials. The legal petition, Leo and Serafina, in a final act of desperate folly, attempted to file against me the following week, requesting an emergency guardianship hearing based on my alleged mental incompetence and erratic behavior, collapsed spectacularly in court. Mr. Harrison calmly presented the judge not only with my own clear-headed testimony and supporting financial documents, but also with the damning private investigator's report detailing their catastrophic debt, Leo's prior inquiries about obtaining power of attorney over me before the wedding incident, and even affidavits from several wedding guests who, upon reflection and seeing the viral videos, attested to Serafina's assault and my dignified response. The judge, a formidable woman known for her sharp intellect and low tolerance for frivolous litigation, not only dismissed their petition with prejudice, but also took the unusual step of fining them substantially for abusing the legal process and attempting to defraud the court. Their financial ruin, already well underway, became swift and absolute. Leo inevitably lost his high-paying sales management job when the public scandal, fueled by those ubiquitous cell phone videos from the wedding, became unavoidable office gossip. Serafina's nebulous image consultant business, predicated entirely on projecting an image of unattainable luxury and social connection, evaporated overnight. They were evicted from their subsidized apartment shortly thereafter when my guarantee was officially withdrawn. The last I heard, relayed reluctantly by my niece, Claire Leo's cousin, they were living in the cramped, finished basement of Serafina's furious parents' suburban home, a far cry from the Back Bay views they had coveted. Leo attempted to contact me exactly 3 times in the 2 years that followed. The first was a week after the wedding, a voicemail filled with incoherent rage, blame, and sputtered accusations. The second came 6 months later, a rambling, tearful, self-pitying plea for money, for understanding, for a return to the way things were. The third call, the one that pierced my carefully constructed defenses, arrived almost exactly a year ago, announcing the birth of his son, my grandson, Arthur, named, perhaps ironically, perhaps poignantly, after my late husband. That call was the hardest to endure. "Mom," he'd choked out, his voice thick with emotion, You have a grandson. You can't let him grow up like this, without knowing you." I am not letting him grow up like anything, Leo. I had told him then, my own voice pained but firm, the boundary clear and unyielding. You and Serafina are. His circumstances are the direct result of choices you made. I have, however, I added, offering the only concession I could, established an irrevocable educational trust fund for him, administered by Mr. Harrison, which he can access when he turns 18. His future educational needs will be provided for. But I will not, under any circumstances, fund your present life or enable your continued irresponsibility. That is your burden to bear, your responsibility to manage. Serafina, predictably perhaps, left him about 6 months after that call. She took the baby and, according to Claire, moved in with another, presumably more solvent, man she had met online. Leo was alone now, working, Claire reported, a string of low-paying, dead-end jobs, the full, crushing weight of his decisions finally, inescapably, his alone to carry. I, on the other hand, channeled my pain, my anger, and my considerable resources into creating something positive from the wreckage. I established the Arthur Hayes Foundation for Elder Justice, using the substantial funds that would have been Leo's inheritance as its initial endowment. Our mission is simple but vital: to provide pro bono legal aid, financial counseling, emergency assistance, and safe temporary housing for seniors who find themselves victims of financial exploitation or abuse, particularly by family members. My dear neighbor, Joseph, whose quiet support meant so much, now sits proudly on the foundation's board. My beloved niece Claire, finding a passion she never knew she had, left her teaching job and is now our lead social worker, a fierce advocate for our vulnerable clients. My story, which was eventually featured, with my permission, in a national magazine under the condition of anonymity for Leo and Serafina, brought in a surprising influx of donations from sympathetic readers across the country. My life, now in my 70th year, is unexpectedly full, rich with purpose. I still volunteer at the library archives, finding solace in the quiet company of history. I still drive my old, reliable Toyota, a comfortable symbol of my chosen values, but I no longer live in secret, shrouded in a self-imposed cloak of modest anonymity. My wealth, Arthur's legacy, is no longer a burden or a secret to be protected, but a tool, just as he always intended. But now, it's a tool wielded openly, purposefully, for justice, for advocacy, for giving voice to those who, like me for so many years, felt silenced and invisible. I often sit on my balcony in the evenings, overlooking the twinkling lights along the Charles River, and reflect on that tumultuous night 2 years ago. The slap, the stunned silence, the cold, calculated reveal. I don't regret what I did. Sadness lingers, yes. A deep maternal grief for the son I lost, not to death, but to his own flawed character. But regret? No. I learned the hardest, most painful lesson of my long life that night, that sometimes the greatest, most profound act of love is not to enable, not to endlessly forgive, but to finally, irrevocably, stop. It is not to shield someone you love from the consequences of their actions, but to allow them, finally, to face them, however harsh they may be. I lost the illusion of the son I thought I had, but in doing so, I regained myself. I discovered, belatedly perhaps, but powerfully, that my intrinsic worth was not tied to my role as a mother, a wife, or a widow, but resided simply in being Madeline, flawed, resilient, and whole. And I learned that true strength isn't measured by how much pain or disrespect you can endure in silence. It's measured by knowing, with absolute unshakable certainty, the precise moment when you have finally, definitively, endured enough, and finding the courage to act on that knowledge. Consequences be damned. My name is Madeline Hayes. I am here, and I will not be erased.